time.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, well, almost afternoon, depending on your time zone, morning if you're here in the Midwest. We're going to be talking about OSHA injury and illness record keeping, a very important topic that we all have to deal with every year. I know there's a lot of questions around this topic because we typically only have to deal with it once a year. So hopefully we're going to clear up some questions. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them and we'll cover that here in a moment. But before we get started, just want to say thank you to our sponsors here. Thank you, Mark. We'll start with the TSSA, MPMA, the HBA ABC, and our ASP, BLD Connection, and Lakes Area Manufacturer Alliance. We appreciate the partnership and what you guys do and continued support throughout the years. Some of you may be new to OECS, some of you may understand what we do, but for those that do not know who we are your total safety solution. We provide health and safety consulting, and our wheelhouse is the small to mid-sized companies, manufacturers, construction. And at the end of the day, our goal is to make sure your teams are safe, your employees are safe, they go home in one piece at the end of the day, and that you're in compliance. And we're here to support you throughout that process. If you have any questions or need help in any of those areas, you're absolutely free to contact us. Visit our website, a lot of great information on there as well, some videos explaining what we do, but we're here to support you to make sure your teams are safe and your businesses are compliant. Now today, it's important, it's not just Connie and I speaking at you. We'd like to get you guys involved. So please enter any questions you have in the chat and we'll hear those and get those answered as quickly as we can. We cannot share this presentation, but there will be a video available on the website within 24 hours. So you can rewatch. If there's something you missed or have any further questions, you can find that there. To introduce ourselves, my name's Chad Priest. I've been with OECS nearly 3 years now, but I've been in the safety industry for nearly 15, specifically on the general industry side, but kind of dabble on both sides of the fence as well. And I'll let Connie introduce herself.
Yep, I'm Connie Van Roel. I obviously work at OECS as well. And I have been here for a little over almost 2 years. I'm coming up on 2. And my background is I worked 15 years in on-site human resources and safety management at many manufacturing companies throughout the southern Minnesota. So I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, Connie's seen and done most of the things that we'll be talking about here today.
Exactly. Yep, this is in my wheelhouse of what I got to do before.
Awesome. So our first question, have you completed your Form 300A yet? Please answer yes or no. If you do not know what that means, you're in the right place. We'll cover what that means and what is required here moving forward. But please answer that question. Just give us an idea of where people are to help address maybe some of your questions a little bit better. We'll give that a couple seconds here. All right, the results are coming in. Most people saying no, which is expected. We still have almost 3 weeks to get these things going here. Some of us are already ahead of the curve, which is fantastic. So what we'll do here is kind of explain why this stuff is important, why we're doing it, and really who needs to do it. So we'll start with record keeping and why this stuff is important to us. So Connie, if you could kind of give us an overview of what this is all about and really what the purpose behind this is.
Sure. So OSHA record keeping, it's a federal requirement for covered employers, and we'll talk about who is a covered employer here as we go. All employers are required to prepare and maintain records of injuries or illnesses that are happening at their workplace that are serious in nature, and we need to use the OSHA 300 log to document those injuries. We're going to talk through all of those pieces here as we go.
Yeah, and that 300 log, I think, is important for people to understand. This is a running, living, breathing document. It's not something you just do once a year.
Right.
It's kind of your way to keep track of where you are and what you're doing. So we see why we need to do it, but what are the, aside from these are the must-haves, we have to do it because we're told to. What is the use of this form and what other ways can we kind of leverage that information to help us?
Yeah, so more than just a task that we have to do based on our to-do list, we should be using this information to evaluate our workplace safety. It should give us a really good snapshot of where injuries are coming in and looking at how can we prevent those injuries from continuing to occur. So what are the hazards and how can we resolve those hazards so we can have an improved safety and health environment for our employees.
And I think it's really important people realize that's why it's important we're keeping accurate records, timely records, being as detailed as possible, because it is a really good tool to use down the line. You know, 1 year doesn't make a trend, but as we continue to do this year after year, a really good way to understand what's happening, where things are happening, and you know, hopefully ways we can be proactive instead of reacting to the injuries and finding ways to prevent them from happening in the future. So I would assume the vast majority of the folks on this webinar are going to fall into the category of, you know, having to do this and completing the form, but there are a few exemptions and exceptions to the rule.
Right. So any employer that has 10 or few employees during the year or during the previous year are exempt. You do not have to fill out OSHA 300 log. But you do want to make sure when you're looking at that 10 or fewer that you do include all full-time, part-time, seasonal, and temporary workers, as they all are considered your employees, even if they're working through a temp agency for OSHA 300 reporting purposes. There are some industries that are partially exempt. We do have a list, or there is a list, but basically it's low-risk industries, and they are exempt regardless of business size. So places like shoe stores and some other retail locations that have a very low risk in their employees have very low risk can become partially exempt and not have to report on an OSHA 300 log.
And I think the important part here is that employee count, where people get a little confused on who's, you know, my employee and how does that number, you know, change and skew. So important we include everybody that's involved. Now, even if you are one of those, you know, exempt, there are some things you still must do, even if you don't have to do the recording. There's still some mandatory things that are required of you, even if you're on that exemption
Yes.
list.
So if you're partially exempt, you are not exempt from reporting workplace incidents or illnesses that result in a fatality, inpatient hospitalization, amputation, or loss of an eye. Those still have to be reported regardless of your size or if you're partially exempt. Additionally, you may be required to report if you are selected to do a survey from the OSHA or the BLS survey, that you have to report your information on a monthly basis. You are required to do that as well, regardless on if you're partially exempt or exempt. Additionally, all companies, regardless, have to follow OSHA's health and safety standards. So even if you're exempt to not have to fill up a piece of paper, you still fall under OSHA and are required to follow their standards.
Yeah, even if you're small and in a low danger area, we still want to make sure we're doing what we can to prevent those things from happening. Now, I think the question I probably get the most often, or one of the questions I get the most often, is understanding, you know, if we have multiple locations, satellite offices, I'm working out in the field for an extended period of time, how do I record those things? Do I need to fill out multiple forms? I think it's important to understand, you know, when is that considered a new facility, a new place, and
Sure.
what's required?
So you would keep a separate OSHA 300 log for each establishment that is expected to be in operation for more than a year. Or if it's short term, you can keep one for all the short term locations. So more than a year, you need a separate. Short term, it can be multiple locations. Every employee must be linked with one establishment. So we have in our clients of ours that may have only 3 employees at one establishment and 20 at another and 10 at another and 15 at another, and you take that combined and you need to keep an OSHA 300 log because it's not based on your separated status, it's your total status as one company.
Got it. And can you explain the must be linked to one establishment? I think that gets a little confused once in a while.
Yep. So every employee should have a home base. So you need to determine what that home base is for that employee. So if you have, let's say, office here in St. Louis Park, and you have an office in Duluth, you have to determine per employee, where is their home base? So is it Duluth or is it St. Louis Park?
And that's the log they will fall on,
Correct.
depending on
And-
where
Yep,
that happens.
exactly.
All right, now we're going to dig into the actual forms, just as a brief overview, and we'll get into a little bit more detail here. But first, you have your OSHA form 300. This is your running total, your running log of things that are happening throughout the year. We then move to our 300A. This is basically the summary of the 300, and this is what we'll be submitting. Again, we'll get into the detail of the requirements and how to do these. And then a form folks may not be as familiar with is the OSHA form 301. This looks very similar to maybe your first report of injury document that you use. Some of the folks that are clients of ours currently, you'd find something similar to this in your aware document, as an appendix. But there's some new potential requirements here, and we'll cover that in a little bit more detail, but wanted to make sure we understand what that form is. So what goes on these forms, I guess, is the big question. And I think some clarity here is important, and there's a lot of caveats and different things that could potentially happen. So what do we need to report? What doesn't need to be reported?
So all injuries or illnesses need to be recorded on your OSHA 300 log within 7 calendar days of that incident occurring. If the incident is work-related, a new case, or it meets the injury illness criteria as described by OSHA, which we will cover all of these things as we go forward here.
So the big one, I think, is work-related. What is that? And I think this can get gray. And of course, I want to just get this out there now. We're going to go through all this and what it means, but throughout the year, if you have questions about if it's recordable, do I need to put this on the log, you can always reach out to us and we can assist you in that decision making. But just kind of an overview of what would fall into that regulated category.
Sure. So if it happens at the employer's location during work hours, if it happens in relationship to using any activity that is work related or involves equipment or property provided by the employer, those would all be deemed work related. Travel status, we're going to cover this on the next slide a little bit further because traveling always gets confusing for people. But it does include incidents during travel for work. It does not include any type of commuting. Additionally, if you have a work-induced condition, so if you have an impairment and your work conditions make your impairment worse, that can be considered work-related as well. And there are exemptions, so eating or drinking during breaks, some of those basic things are exempt and are not considered work-related. I've had people bringing cans of soup for lunch and need some stitches because they opened their can wrong, but those are not considered work-related incidences.
Yeah, and to kind of get into a little bit more detail, and I think working from home is becoming a far more common situation, and that gets again a little convoluted as what is an injury happening, at your home office, along with traveling for work. And, the way we work now is changing. So there's some details we need to understand and how to understand those different environments too.
Yeah, and I think work environment on this page is pretty common, like it's actually going to a location and using the things at the physical location to do my tasks or my job. Traveling for work gets a little more difficult to understand. So any type of work related activity, if it is incurred during the employer's interest activities. So for example, if I am working, I'm at a convention and I'm taking some clients out for dinner and I have a situation that happens during that dinner, that would be considered a work-related incident because it's the employer's interest activities as me taking that client out. And the only reason I would be there to do that is due to my job. There are some home away from home principles that are covered or not covered as part of people staying in hotels. So home away from home just means that if I get to my hotel and I'm doing home-like stuff. So if I'm taking a shower, watching TV, whatever, off work hours, not related to anything of the employer's interest, those activities would not be considered work-related. And then if I am doing any kind of detours for personal reasons, they're not work-related as well. Working from home, so injuries or illnesses that occur from working at home, if they're, again, occur while the employee is performing work for pay or compensation in my home and are directly related to my performance of work rather than the general home environment. So if I am doing it, say I'm, I have a home office and the company, I have a chair and a desk and my chair totally, breaks. Then, is that work related if I'm in the process of work, or is that home related?
Sure.
So usually home environment is going to be more of the bricks and sticks and walls that are around my home, not typically the equipment that I'm using.
So falling down the stairs with your laundry basket does not,
No, unfortunately,
does not count.
we don't get to count that one.
Okay. So one of the other things that need to be, the box checked in order for recordable is a new case. And we'll talk about what, is going to be retroactive on, past year 300s, but in order for it to be recordable for this situation in this year, it needs to be a new case. And there's a lot of things that lead to defining new case and,
Right.
Making sure it's not related to a past injury or not re-aggravating something, maybe from a recordable from 2022, for example, and that's going to go back on something else. So can you kind of dig into, what is that new case requirement and how do we define that?
Yep. So it has to be a new diagnosis. It cannot be linked to anything else that was recorded on a prior log. It has to be a whole new situation. It should have a distinct time occurrence of when it occurred. So if I had something new that occurred, let's say I broke my arm today, that'd be a new occurrence. And if it was that I hurt my back a year ago and that was a recordable, that case, that wouldn't be a new case and go on my new sheet, but the information would go on the old OSHA 300 log.
Yeah, I think the distinct time frame is sometimes a difficult one to navigate, especially, with soft tissue injuries and back injuries, especially that kind of come and go, may pop up or cause another injury. So again, you need to really dig into that, understand each of those specific instances and understand, does it fall into this category or is it something I'm going to need to amend on a past injury?
So it's all based on, is this something new that's just newly being recorded, or did the same injury occur and this is a re-aggravation or a new injury and not the old injury coming back up?
Right. Okay. Now, there's different severity, of course, of these injuries, and it's important we understand kind of what bucket these fall into for recording purposes, of course, from death all the way down to basic first aid, medical treatments. Can you kind of bring us through the list of these different buckets of severity?
So all of these things would need to be recorded on your OSHA 300 log. So death, days away from work, restricted work activity, if you're transferred to another job, medical treatment beyond first aid, loss of consciousness, and then a significant injury or illness diagnosed. We are going to cover each one of these to some degree as we continue on, just to speak through how would we put those on the log and what additional things do we need to consider as we're trying to determine, is this a reason that it would go on the OSHA 300 log? If you've already done your OSHA 300 log, this would be a good time to kind of review what was the reason it got put on the log, and does that meet the criteria to actually be on your log? Because one of the common mistakes is either over-reporting or under-reporting, and we want to make sure it's accurate to give a good snapshot of what our year looked like.
Yeah, surprisingly enough, I think I see over-recording more than under.
Yeah, I see both, but people want to fail on the side of putting more information on. It's like, you just want to follow what they've got outlined here to what we have to record.
So we'll get into a little bit more of the details of the actual log itself, but hopefully this is something we never have to deal with and you never have to deal with. But if there is a death on site. There are very specific things that we need to follow, and, how we record that as well. Of course, there's a specific column for that on your 300. But the recording of it is not the important piece. Of
No.
course, there's other things we need to consider, and time is important as well. So if we have a death on site, there's some things we have to do and how we report those things.
Right. So yes, they need to get filled out on your OSHA 300 log within that 7-day mark. But if you have a fatality, you must report it to OSHA within 8 hours of learning of its occurrence. You can do that by either calling your nearest OSHA office, calling the 24-hour hotline, or you can report online, but that is required of all employers, regardless if you're partially exempt or not. You do have to record all fatalities, not just on your OSHA 300 line or log, but by outreach to OSHA.
And if it's happening, after hours, kind of odd times, those calls are time stamped. The
Correct.
online report is time stamped
Yeah.
to make sure you're within that 8-hour time frame.
You will want to be prepared. You will want to prepare your brain a little bit prior to that call, because you are going to need to give them some basic information about the employee, like your employer name, the employees that were affected, location, time of incident. So make sure, who they should contact, a description of what occurred. So that is what you would be sharing with them.
Right. Now, there are some requirements for more severe cases of injury as well, other than just recording it on the log.
Right. So in addition to the fatality, we do have to report within 24 hours any work-related amputations, loss of an eye, or inpatient hospitalization of one or more employees. So one thing that I often see get described improperly, and people are lost in whether or not they have to call it in, is that if your employee gets part of their finger amputated, it will depend on how the doctor writes it, but typically if any part of the bone, if the fleshy part, they won't say that it's an amputation, but if any part of the bone is removed, it will be considered an amputation, and you do need to contact OSHA within that 24-hour period.
Great. Now, moving on to one of the other buckets that one of these injuries could fall into is a days away case, and it's important we're counting these properly. It's not just the days they would have worked, it's the days they could have worked, right?
Right. So days away means that a medical provider has said that they are not allowed to return back to work due to their injury or illness. You would need to count the number of calendar days the employee was unable to work. And this does include any weekend days. Even if you don't typically work on a weekend and they got injured on Friday, you would still need to count Saturday and Sunday and whenever they can return back. Additionally, if you had a holiday, or if they were going on vacation the day after their injury, all of those would be counted as days away, as they are unable to work if you needed them to. So you want to make sure that you're counting that appropriately. You do cap the day count at 180 days away. So if you get to a point where they are going to be away for a long period of time, once you get to 180 days, that's as long as you need to record that one incident. So you can stop the count if the employee leaves for any reason outside of their injury or illness. And if a medical opinion exists, so if someone says they can't work, you have to follow that opinion.
Even if they want to come back.
Even if they want to come back, they would need to reach out and get that cleared up with their medical provider. You have to follow that opinion as the employer.
All right. Now, the way we record these on our log, you'll see here in column H, you'll check days away from work. And again, we don't include the day of the injury. It's the subsequent days after. You'll see that in column K here, where we're going to plug in the number of days that they were away from work.
And just know that that number may change. So you may think they're only going to be out for 7 days, and then they get to that day. You want to make sure that when you're doing your log, if you're doing it on paper, you're going to want to make sure you have an ability to erase it or update it, so that you can make sure that that days away from work is accurate to the actual amount of days they were
That's a good point.
unable to work.
And then we need to categorize what it was. you'll see your options here, if it's an injury, illness, down the line. So making sure we're recording these properly, to what they actually were. And then the more accurate we can be, the better, not just for the current year, but, subsequent years, where we can see what actually happened and get a good understanding of where our injuries are coming from. The next category would be days with restricted work or a job transfer.
Yeah, so restricted work or job transfer. So restricted work would mean that I can do my job, but I can't do all aspects of my job. So a common thing would be if I typically need to lift 40 pounds, but I've been restricted to be only lifting 10 by my doctor due to my injury or illness, that would be considered restricted work. Maybe I can do my job, but I still can't do 100% of it. It would still need to be recorded on this OSHA 300 log. Job transfer is if we are going to transfer me or the injured person to a different job that meets the restrictions that the medical provider has provided us with, then that would be considered the same thing, and it would be a job transfer.
Now, I know a question that's come up before is, well, I was planning on transferring this individual to this job anyway. When does that become?
Yeah,
it's a little blurry when it comes to
it is a little blurry. I would say that unless you had it in writing that you were planning to do this and the timing was as of such, you would have to consider them in the job that they were in when they got injured, if that's what they worked on a regular basis.
And then when we record these in, whether we're determining if it's a day away from work or restricted time, it's important we're selecting the more serious of the two, correct?
Correct. So in step 3, where it says classify the case, you'd only circle one. And in this case, if you had someone that was maybe out for 5 days after their injury and then came back under restricted work. So again, I can't lift more than 10 pounds, but I typically would. You would mark column H as days away because that's the most severe. But then you would put hours in how many days I was away from work. So maybe that was 5. And then how many days was I restricted or on a job transfer? And that number would go in that. So you only put one thing in the cases at work or classifying the case, but you may need to fill out both of those other two areas depending on your situation.
So always only one thing selected in step 3, but
Yep.
there may be multiple numbers or things recorded
Correct.
down the line from there.
And then additionally, you would still fill out column M or the last column to dictate what the injury or illness, if it was an injury or illness.
Sure. Now we're moving on to cases with medical treatment beyond first aid, and we're going to get into what that means. But there you have option J to select for those other recordable cases.
Right. And I think this is where a lot of people aren't sure, like, is that a recordable? Is that not a recordable? How do we determine that? And OSHA does a very good job at telling us exactly what is considered recordable and not recordable. So we're going to cover that as we go through here. We can move on to that next slide. Just to give you some indication, what is considered medical treatment? So medical treatment is anything done by a licensed healthcare professional, treatment that is done with them, and it's always going to be procedures beyond first aid. So that is kind of the key. Questions often come up like, what if they want to go to their chiropractor? That's fine, but it is considered more than first aid, and they would need to, it would need to be recorded on your log appropriately. So anytime they're given a prescription medication, even in cases where it's just a higher dose of Advil, but it's a prescribed higher dose, that would need to be recorded. So we will walk through what are the symptoms or what is considered first aid.
So there's a lot of, again, I think questions behind this because we need to define what it is. And again, OSHA does a great job of being very specific because you're not the only ones that have ever had this question before.
Right.
So things from, immunizations that may be done just on a regular schedule. If you're doing basic first aid, hot and cold therapy, applying ice, putting a heat pack to loosen up a muscle. I think another one that oftentimes gets confused is the non-rigid means of support, like a sling, if it's just as a support structure, not a a rigid cast or something like that.
Right. And one thing to keep in mind, all of these things may not be happening at your environment. They can go on to a clinic and receive this type of care, but all of these types of care, even if it's done by a medical professional, is considered first aid and not needing to be reported on your OSHA 300 log.
And here's a few more of the types of things that would be considered first aid. Though it's not fun, relieving that pressure of the fluid from under the nail falls into that category. Removing foreign bodies from an eye, but it's important how we're removing that item, correct?
Yep. So as long as the foreign body is getting removed by irrigation or a cotton swab, either by you at your facility or by a medical provider, then that is considered first aid. So finger guards, so if I break my finger, they put a finger guard on, that's considered first aid. Massages, all of those types of things are considered first aid.
Great. Now, this is an important slide, I think, because this is a big, what do we do in this situation?
Right.
And we've alluded to some of these before, but these are considered non-recordable. And my favorite one, because this is something that I dealt with in the past, is voluntary participation, especially if you have a exercise facility on site or you're doing some type of team building event. When does it become recordable and when does it fall into non-recordable?
Yeah, so it has to be voluntary participation. So anytime you're incentivizing or putting any type of incentive for people to do any type of wellness or fitness programs, you could that may result in becoming a recordable incident on your OSHA 300 log. So make sure that if you are doing those types of things, that you're doing them on a voluntary basis.
And we covered a little bit about the eating, drinking, if you're on your own time during a break, preparing food, you burn yourself, you cut yourself on a can. Would not fall into a recordable category.
A couple of other ones that I think are important that come up often in my world is if you're on a company parking lot or access road, if you are driving, it's not typically a recordable, but if an injury occurs in your parking lot, it may be recordable depending on if it meets the other severity issues. So that things you want to consider if you winter here, making sure your parking lots are set up appropriately.
Yeah, this is the season for slip, trips, and falls. And you see a lot of those happening.
And the other one is just symptoms surfacing at work. So if signs of a non-work related condition, that my pain surfaces while I'm at work doesn't necessarily mean it's a work related incident.
Right. Now moving on to loss of consciousness, this isn't pretty much an automatic recordable, no matter how short the duration of loss of consciousness was. This is something we do need to be recording.
Yep. So that would just be an other recordable case and an injury recorded in M.
Now, a few more of those that kind of fall into this category that maybe not as common, but still things that would fall into that other recordable category.
Yeah. So significant diagnosis of an injury or illness. So if I was diagnosed with a cancer and it was related to my job, it would need to be on the OSHA 300 log. If I have needle sticks or sharps injury where I am poked and may have been contaminated with somebody else's bodily fluid, that would need to go on there. Hearing loss, we're going to cover a little bit more here in a second, but tuberculosis, COVID-19 is still something that needs to get recorded if the outbreak happened at your place of employment.
Yeah, we'll touch on that here in a moment too. But as it pertains to hearing loss, if we have that standard threshold shift beyond when we had that initial baseline audiogram, it might be recordable.
Right. So typically, or honestly, like people should, especially a lot of times we're getting these our audiograms done by vehicles that are coming to our facility. So anytime you get a first record of a shift, you should be sending them on to have a further medical evaluation to determine where that shift occurred from and what the causes potentially could be. One thing that I always suggest is, make sure you do have current testing, audio testing of your facility to see your noise levels.
Yeah.
To ensure that if you have somebody that has a shift, it will better solidify, whether or not that their hearing loss was work related, because people are at concerts and they're doing things, and you never want to take a one-time test and then say, well, they had a shift and we're good, because people could have a cold or they were doing different things that caused them to have the shift, and they don't actually have a shift. They just have a temporary hearing loss.
Right, and I think it's important to let people know when these tests are happening too, so you can plan ahead, so they're not going to a concert the
Right,
day before, or going to, work on their car and
Right.
being a loud garage, before, where we have that temporary hearing loss and it could impact
Yep.
the test. And I think a very valid point to making sure we have documentation. And if
Mhm.
we can do some, noise monitoring and understand, here's where maybe some pockets we need to address, or we have no concerns. And that really kind of gives you that extra documentation to move forward with a case that, helping prove this probably wasn't work
Right.
related in that situation.
Right.
Now, the thing that just won't go away,
Right.
COVID-19.
So COVID-19 still needs to be recorded on your OSHA 300 log if you have employees that have it and there's evidence available to the employer that the illness was contracted at work. So if you have outbreak in your facility, it still needs to be recorded.
I think we've all become a little bit more experienced with this,
Yeah.
and, how to navigate these things, but there's still a lot of,
Well, I think the
questions.
question that gets brought up is it still a recordable thing? Because now we've had it for a while, but yes, it's still needing to go on your OSHA 300 log.
great. Now, privacy protection, of course, we want to make sure we're respecting people's privacy when we're recording these types of things. And there are some things we have to consider when we're documenting these
Right.
issues.
So as we will see on the OSHA 300 log, it gives us an opportunity or a place to put employees' names. There are times that putting the employee's name there is not appropriate, and those would be considered privacy cases. If there's an injury to an intimate body part, or a sexual assault, or a mental illness, or if the employee voluntarily asks for their name not to be put on the list, are all privacy cases, and you would need to just write privacy case rather than the employee's name.
Right.
You can't do that unless they fall into one of these categories, and I can say that if somebody voluntarily requests, you would want them to write that out, just to have that proof that it wasn't just admitted by you as the employer.
Right. Now, the 301 form, we highlighted this, right in the beginning, but I want to spend a little extra time on this because there's some new requirements
Right.
involved.
So the OSHA 301 log is just an injury and illness incident report. A lot of us have used first reports of injury instead of this, or something very similar with this information on it. And that has been acceptable and continues to be acceptable. As we talk about the 2024 and submitting the 2024 information, which we'll get to in a minute, there seems to be more need to potentially fill out this information on this actual form, as some of the requirements for what we're reporting to OSHA have changed on January 1st. So we'll talk more about that, but this is basic information about the person and then the injury. So very similar to your first report of injury of what needs to get filled out.
Yeah, so, most of what we were using is basically the same information, just in a different format.
Yep.
So we might as well use the form we're going to need to submit, right?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense as the new requirement is kind of pushing us to do this, so.
Now, our 300A, what we're going to be covering, making sure we're filling this out properly, again, due in about 3 weeks,
Mhm.
making sure we're getting this filled out and posted properly. So just want to cover a couple of different sections here to make sure we're doing it the right way and we have the right type of information.
So if you can go back one slide,
Yeah.
sorry. So on the left-hand side, or my left-hand side, where it says number of cases, days away, That information is actually coming from your OSHA 300 log. So as we went through and described things that should or shouldn't be on your log and how you record it on your OSHA 300 log, basically you're just putting that information here as a summary. So if you found things like you're doing your log and you found things were recorded that shouldn't have been recorded, you can just strike them off and then not include them in your summary as they wouldn't be required. So you're just putting on that information from that log. And then if you go on to the establishment information, it's very tricky to see, but basically you're going to fill out all of your basic information about your industry description, your classification. Then you will also, and this you will want to make sure that you're calculating correctly for the next couple pieces, but you're going to do the average number of employees that you have, and then the total number of hours that you worked. Basically, what you are providing is information for OSHA to understand how many injuries on a ratio basis that you're having in your workplace on an annual basis. This form should be signed by an executive or the highest ranking official in your establishment. So if it's an owner or an officer, as they are the ones that are held responsible for this information. So, us being safety people, we might not be the person that should sign this. It should be somebody that's a little more high ranking than us, so that there is complete transparency within our organization that this is our summary.
Yeah, and this is, kind of what you're going to be going through right now, your annual summary of what happened in the past year. And I just want to reemphasize the importance. This is why it's really important that we're keeping up with that 300 form. So it's accurate. We're not scrambling at the end of the year to try to figure out what's happening, what are our current numbers. At this point of the year, it should be easy. You're basically taking the information you've collected over the year.
Right.
You can plug it right into that 300A form and be good to go. Now, this must be posted from February 1st through April. There's a date, number, and range there for a reason. That is the amount of time it needs to be posted.
Correct. It needs to be posted in a conspicuous spot where all of your employees have access to see it. Because it is information that is required from the employer to the employees. And it is a best practice, and they do give you dates to take it down after that April 30th deadline, as that is the only requirement to have that posted.
Yeah, don't give them reasons to ask questions they don't need to ask.
Yeah.
How long do we have to keep these things for?
So we have to keep the OSHA 300 log for 5 years. And we do have to update any 300 log that has changes throughout that period. So if we had, for example, say somebody had carpal tunnel syndrome and they got diagnosed with carpal tunnel syndrome in 2023, but their surgery isn't until 2024 for their carpal tunnel. That 2024 information, or the days they miss, would actually need to go back and be updated on that previous case. So it would be updated in 2023. And you would only update the OSHA 300 log for any situations like that. You do not change the summary forms 300A or the injury reporting form. So the only thing that gets changed is that OSHA 300 log. If you need to count days or make something that maybe was just restricted to now days away, you would make those changes, and you have to make them for that 5-year period.
And remember that new case definition. That's when it'll start recording in this year, but if it's an old injury or a past, that'll go on to the previous log. Now, some of us, or most of us, I hope, should have already been doing this and comfortable with the ITA, the electronic reporting of that 300A. But this is a requirement now for most folks that need to report this.
Yeah, majority of the industry is anytime either you have more than 250 employees or you are more than 20, but you're in a high risk industry like construction, manufacturing, warehousing, freight. There is a list of high risk on the injury tracking application. If you go to the injury reporting thing, it will tell you, but then you are required as well to electronically report there. That changed last year.
So, and there you see the website. That is where you're going to go to access that application to report those electronically. Just like all government websites, they're a little intimidating when you first open them, I think, but it really is pretty straightforward. You got to create your login and make sure you
Right.
have your access
Yeah.
to make sure you're getting that updated.
And if you haven't done it in the past, you would just go through and create a new account and then be able to put in your business information to enter your, or to be able to enter in your OSHA 300A law.
Now back to the 301. What are the requirements now with this new form?
Yeah, so January 1st, 2024, so establishments with more than 100 employees in certain industries are required to electronically submit the 300 and the 301 log. So industries, we have a website there, but when you look at that website, you will find majority of manufacturing industries fall in that. So if you're a manufacturing company and have more than 100 employees, you will have to submit your 300 log, and then as well as an incident report or the 301 log for any incident that's on your 300 log. So if I have 5 recordables on my OSHA 300 form, I have to submit 5 301 logs that correspond with those injuries that were on my 300 log.
Perfect.
So manufacturing, additionally, warehousing, you'll find most warehousing environments are also on the high risk list, as well as exterior construction companies. So if you do exterior construction, anything outside or in the process of constructing a business or a building, you also fall into needing to record if you have more than 100 employees.
Awesome. All right, that wraps up the content. I know we have some questions and we will get to those here in a moment. But just some housekeeping things before we get to the questions. If you'd be so kind to rate the webinar here, let us know how we did. If the information was up to snuff and you learned some things, that'd be great. Your feedback is always appreciated to understand ways we can improve moving forward. We'll give it a few seconds. All right, just a few more moments. Wonderful. Thank you all for your feedback. We do appreciate it. And we're going to move forward here to a couple things. But first, just want to let you know we do have another webinar coming up here in April, going to be for Minnesota OSHA safety grants, a really great topic that we can all take advantage, or you all can take advantage of. It's a great program. And we're going to have Julie and Dave talk you through that. Some folks that have a lot of experience with that. So I highly recommend you attend and get that great information as well. And of course, if you have any questions regarding the webinar today, and we'll cover some of them here in a moment, feel free to reach out to myself or Connie. Would be very happy to help you answer some of those questions. And again, if you have any safety needs, no matter how big or small, a special project, a training, an audit, please reach out. Let us know how we can help, and I would be happy to help create the strong safety culture that I know you're looking to accomplish. And again, thank you again to our sponsors. We appreciate the partnership and the support. And now we have some time for questions. Justine, do you have any questions that we have?
We do. We have a lot. So we'll see how far we can get on these. And then I know in the past that we've been able to follow up individually.
Yeah, so we will answer as many as we can, and then anything that we don't get answered, we will respond and follow up.
Okay, perfect. I did put your camera back on if you wanted it. Okay, is going to urgent care to get stitches, but released right away after the fact count as inpatient hospitalization?
No, that is a recordable because they got more than first aid, but that is not inpatient hospitalization. People can go and be hospitalized under being diagnosed for 24 to 48 hours. And that isn't considered inpatient hospitalization until they are treated for an actual illness or injury. But clinics are not hospitalization.
And good to get, some documentation of if, maybe it's just stitches, but are there any limitations, things they cannot do with that injury?
Okay, I'm not sure if you have time for this one, but I'll put it out there. Please review separate 300A forms for employees in different work locations.
So I'm assuming they're referring to if they've identified a place as a permanent or a different.
James, you can put a follow-up if you want in the chat. As he's waiting to get more clarification, I'll ask another one. Can we use the 301 form from non-recordables as well?
I wouldn't. I would keep a separate log for non-recordables, as 300 logs are part of OSHA's inspection. And say you have a bunch of near misses or non-recordables, but it continuously happens and you're not doing anything to mitigate the hazard. You're just giving more information about the fact that the hazard's not getting mitigated. So it is good to keep a log because it is good data information to be able to look at where your injury is coming from and what can you do to prevent them. But I would not keep non-OSHA or non-recordables on the OSHA 300 log.
With the 301, it's kind of, like you said, you're gonna have forms that are similar to that, and you can use those, basically the same information. But you're gonna want to use that 301 to match up with what's on your actual 300. And those are the things you'll submit.
Yeah, because on there, it'll also ask you like a case number, so it's the first column on that OSHA 300 log, so you're just matching up anything that's written on your OSHA 300 log with the more information about what occurred, that this person has a recordable injury.
And to that point, you create that case number, just make sure it's unique and it's not.
Right.
And those match up, the 301 to 300.
Yeah.
Okay, James did answer as I asked for more clarification. Yes, a subset of employees that work at different location than the general population of employees.
So they will look at the total employees employed by your company as a whole. So if they are all under your company umbrella, being paid out of your payroll, being underneath your company, you will need to keep an OSHA 300 log. You may want to do one for each establishment, depending on how many people are moving around. You could maybe do, or you could do one big one, as long as everyone has a home location.
Okay. Do COVID reportables need to be listed as a privacy case?
They do not fall in the category of what OSHA has described. If an employee is asking voluntarily for you not to put their name, then yes. And we are only talking about COVID cases that happened in relationship to employment, not a personal COVID case.
And again, I would recommend getting some documentation saying.
Right.
You don't want that recorded as well.
So.
Okay. We have less than 10 employees, but many volunteers. Where does that put us in reporting?
So again, it depends on how many volunteers, and really, what is that employee count? And if they are working for you and they're, I guess it's the question, are they being paid?
Right. That is.
I guess that's really the question.
So if they're volunteers, no, and you have less than 10 and they're not getting paid or any type of stipend or any form of any kind of payment, then you would not include them on your OSHA 300 log. If they're getting paid by somebody else, then you are their employer during that period. So if it's a school program or something and they're getting paid through a school program, but they're working at your establishment, they would be considered a temporary employee instead of a volunteer.
Okay. So if I have an employee days away for 5 days with 2 days restrictions, but not stitches, just would care recorded to OSHA? Did that make sense?
So the 5 days, so if they have days away and it was due to the injury and it was, can be tied to that work-related injury, you would still record the days away. And then if there's restricted work, you record the amount of days that were restricted, but you're only checking again the worst case scenario, which would be the days away in that situation, not both the days away and the restricted duty, if that answers the question.
Okay. What year does the 301 and 300 logs start? Data from 2023 or in 2024?
So from what I can read, that submitting both logs will be required this year. Submitting the 300 log and the 301s to substantiate the information that's on your 300 log. It has to get reported by March 2nd in the reporting system, OSHA's reporting system.
Does healthcare fall into needing to submit the 301 logs?
Not that I saw, healthcare was not on the list, but you can find the whole list on that. This will be on our website, and that we can send out where you can find the whole list after this as well. There is a list of industries that are on or classifications of industries that are on having to send that information in.
Okay, that just answered another question is about tests. Okay, what is best practice for average number of employees if your employee count changes a lot throughout the year?
So what I would do in my previous life, because I had that same, we'd have a big increase at one time of the year. You just average out the whole year. So you take per month, how many employees did you have? You can just take the last payroll of each month and count how many people got paid, and then divide that in to find your average.
Yeah.
That's the easiest way.
Yeah, I've seen people do it by pay period, by week.
Yeah.
And then to divide that number by however you kind of broke that up, whether
Yeah.
it's by month, pay period, by week,
Right.
to get to that number.
Exactly.
How do you record lost times days or restricted work days if the days cross over a year? Say end of 2023 was on lost time and it continues into 2024.
So everything would get recorded on your 2023 log, as that is where the lost time or the injury occurred. Everything is driven back to that date. You would put nothing on your 2024 log for that case, but you would update your 2023 log as that number changes. So everything goes back to previous logs.
Okay, great. How do you respond to work compensation denial incidents?
So work comp and OSHA are two separate things. Something might be OSHA recordable, but not work comp related. What you're looking there for is you have to meet the criteria under OSHA to be recordable. So if the question is, was it work related, and there's proof that it wasn't work related, you don't put it on your OSHA 300 log because you don't meet that criteria. So it all depends on what information is provided and information from your work comp carrier and the reasons that they denied it. Because you have to meet the criteria to put it on your OSHA log. If there's information other than that, then that's how you make that determination.
Yeah, the criteria is gonna be different for each.
Mhm.
It could be a comp case, but not a recordable, could be
Right.
recordable, not a comp. So there's different, it depends on your carrier, of course, and
Yeah,
really paying attention to the criteria for each to make sure you're recording it properly.
yeah.
Okay, believe it or not, we got through all the questions. I hope that was all answered. Yeah, we have 2 minutes left.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Well, thanks, everybody. We appreciate the questions, and please reach out if there's anything you think of beyond this. Recording will be available here shortly. So if you need to rewatch something or forgot, you can find it on our website.
Thank you, everyone. Have yourself a fantastic day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.